Hello and welcome and a happy new year to you all. This is my first video of 2025 and it will focus primarily on the chess played in the World Blitz Championships between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. And very briefly, of course, the first 13 games was a Swiss section in the World Blitz Championships that then achieved the top 8 players, and those players went into the knockout stages. Of course, there was the quarterfinals followed by the semis, and finally it reached the final between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. This was game 3, where Jan was in a must-win with the white pieces, having lost his 2 first games of the 4-game final match. As a result, 2-0 up, Magnus simply needed to hold a draw, and he would be the outright World Blitz champion. Well, of course, as you probably have heard, that did not happen, and this was a key moment in that game, where after knight to c7, yes, forking, well, black had this response. Carlsen shot in with their queen, attacking b1. Of course, this is not possible with the rook being captured, so bishop takes h6, defending with a discovered defense, and also putting clear pressure and using the pin. This rook had very usefully been lifted up by Jan earlier in the game. And at this moment, Carlsen, of course, 70 seconds on his clock versus 30 seconds. Had he spent a little bit of time, perhaps the conversation would be very different. He captured on a4, admitting that he's going to lose the exchange, wagering perhaps, after capture with his queen, to just return the queen to defend and also avoid any tempo gains. Perhaps with 5 pawns versus 4, with pressure perhaps placed here and just an open file, and maybe this bishop's hanging, well, perhaps this would be the best way to lose the exchange. Unfortunately, because, and we'll see this a little bit later, because these pawns are just immobile, there's a lovely outpost for this bishop and rook to use. Ultimately, the extra rook is magnified hugely, and it has a semi-open file. This knight's semi-paralyzed. If it moves, the rook will win. If this pawn, as we'll see, moves, then rook can attack a6, and so on and so forth. However, it's worth looking at what Carlsen could have played had he spent a bit of time. Instead of taking on a4, rook e7, and feel free to pause the video to find the follow-up, because bishop g5 seems to essentially fork or skewer these two to one another. And there's a critical move here that black can play that relies on the fact that this knight is short of squares, it's not got too many places to move. And what have you found the move? It is rook c8. Because after bishop takes, the pressure on here, of course, this bishop was the primary culprit, it's gone. This queen's simply too locked away. It cannot comfortably attack g7 anytime soon. Take quite a while, at least 2 moves. And there's a lot of issues going on for white in the meantime. For example, this and this. And as a result, now, having won the bishop for the rook, and this knight is attacked, well, this is the problem. The rook covers these two. The pawn covers this. Obviously, this pawn covers this. That leaves these two, but the queen backwards moves are the hardest to see, of course. Even if the queen is attacked, she drops back to f7. And from here, black is going to win a second minor piece and have a bishop and a knight versus a rook, which typically is better for the 2 minor pieces. It's 2 pieces after all versus 1. At most, white might be able to win a pawn. Everywhere else is doomed to be captured, of course, on all these squares. White can't even capture a second pawn, because if they do, despite seeming to fork and maybe demanding rook c5, black says, no, I'll ignore that and attack right back, hitting f2. If the queen now captures, then the queen will capture with a check, force king h1, and queen f1 will happen with mate to follow, with the rook reaching f1, back rank mate. And as a result, black is much better. The knight is going to c4, and Carlsen would have very likely won this game, let alone drawn. Despite that, of course, queen takes a4 all the way back here instead of rook e7 was played. And of course, it's very tricky in these time controls, and at this moment, both players had played for many, many hours and many, many days. And suddenly, Carlsen is the exchange down. The queen on e8, well, it's defending some things, but also is potentially a little bit clumsy. The rooks do speak for themselves. They're very, very powerful. A rook is a rook at the end of the day. Despite Carlsen having a pawn for the exchange, it is 5 for black, 4 for white. Well, this rook is just so powerful, blockading 2 of them, for one thing, and also putting pressure here. And meanwhile, the other rook is paralyzing the knight and the pawn. If the pawn, as we'll see, moves to b5, then simply rook a1 simply wins the pawn. If Carlsen hadn't played b5, then this knight's doomed to stay there forever. So it's very tricky. Suddenly the rooks are active, black's pieces are not. This bishop has to stay defending here for a lot of the game. This queen can't really find much space to move or do anything particularly useful. Perhaps f7 is the best square, but it's not got as much venom as we saw in previous lines. And ultimately, I'll flick through the moves. Carlsen ended up losing this game because the two rooks were too powerful. There are a few little details. For example, rook g4 was just to block the rook coming to d1. But after a further 20 moves of play, Jan Nepomniachtchi used his very good, of course, technique to beat Magnus Carlsen and go 2-1 in the final match. As we see here, the rooks just outmaneuvered the bishop and rook. And in a further dozen moves, pawns dropped off the board, further pawns dropped off the board. Queens were forcibly traded at this moment here with queen f3, forking here and here. It's worth saying if queen d7, then basically forced mate with rooks and queens entering into black king. And despite one or two spite checks from black, the white rooks simply powered through, one on g6. And at this moment, here, Carlsen resigned because after king e8, rook h7 would be played, and that is going to be forced mate. Hence why Carlsen, of course, resigned. So that was game 3 of the 4-game match. Of course, I breezed through the remaining moves because game 4 was especially important and significant and exciting. Jan Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces had to win. And, well, Carlsen came with 1e4. And e6, the French defense. A very interesting choice, but it actually makes quite a lot of sense, to my mind at least. Of course, had Jan chosen e5, well, Carlsen is one of the best players in pretty much all e4, e5 openings, whether it be the Scotch game, the Juco Piano, or the Roy Lopez, whatever it is, Carlsen would be pretty well versed, and Carlsen would get to choose which of those he went down. The perk, of course, with d6 would have been a little bit too risky. Often white can just blow black off the board. The Sicilian probably would have been met by an Alpin, c3 Sicilian, where Carlsen has proven many times before that he can get a very pleasant, almost a must-win position in his shoes. If he were to be in one, he could use that. So that would have led to c3 Sicilians, or a line Carlsen would be very happy with. So e6 perhaps keeps things with some hope for Jan. And indeed, he got a vibrant position with play across both sides of the board, which, as we'll see, is exactly what Jan needed. Now, we have seen this before on my channel in the World Championship match, where Gukesh and Ding saw this a couple of times at least, and it was the Steinitz variation. And at this point, as I mentioned before, both f4 and knight f3 in some order or choice is quite common, after knight c6 that is, and instead Carlsen played a3, sort of a prophylactic move saying, well, if you play a5, a4, you cannot deconstruct with the undermining move of a3. Also, potentially, if black persistently doesn't play a5, there's definitely some b4 ideas just to lock it up. Typically, if you can, in response to a5, achieve b5, so it often requires this knight to have moved. But definitely just defending against some queenside attack, solidifying the structure. It does weaken the light squares, but because black's bishop isn't exactly ready to do anything on the light squares, and it's more of a dark square strategy by black, certainly putting these on 5 dark squares makes a lot of sense. And a5 nonetheless, defending the squares, stopping b4, and just generally grabbing some space, hoping to get the queen to a5, as we saw in the World Championship match in game 1, I believe, where Ding ended up winning with the black pieces. Knight f3, very safe and solid. Again, Carlsen simply needs to draw, and Jan was in a must-win position. After a4, h4, so both sides playing on both sides of the board makes a lot of sense. If the center is closed, if it's a closed position in the middle, then attack on the wing, and vice versa. If it's closed on the wing, attack in the center. The center is closed, relatively. There's some tension, but ultimately these pawns are not shifting in the red circled squares. And for that reason, Jan kept his king on e8 for a long time and didn't castle kingside at all, in fact, because if it did, often white simply, as we can tell, is maneuvering to attack the kingside. So of course putting your king there makes it even worse. If you lose a pawn over here, well, at least you're not getting checkmated. But if you put the king over there, that's a big, big, big risk. Knight b6 to come to c4. Defending this, perhaps, but just generally maneuvering to the queen side, piece power and so on. Knight f4, so both sides maneuvering their knights to better squares. Knight a5, clearly hoping to jump in to two different squares. And white is a little bit better, if not significantly better, just because of the space and the piece maneuverability. But certainly, Jan Nepomniachtchi with black has achieved quite a nice fluid position where, although perhaps they're a little bit worse, definitely it's better than a completely drawish Roy Lopez or a Sicilian where white has all the cards. There's definitely some fluidity to this position, as we may well see. So rook b1 was played by Carlsen, just prophylactically avoiding the fork. It's worth saying this knight, if it ever captures here, it is more of a knight pair game here, because with the centre locked and the knights being so far forwards, able to hop and attack, definitely essentially playing, what would that be, 4 moves just to win the bishop when these pawns firmly block this bishop isn't exactly advantageous for black and is potentially a giant waste of time if you just win this bishop. So often the knight will just sit on b3 or c4 and look nice and do better things than just trading itself off for a bishop in an otherwise closed position. It's worth saying bishop d3 is also possible. As a result of all that, white doesn't need to be afraid of this fork. And this would certainly be a useful move. There's even this possibility, d takes c5, and it makes a lot of sense that Carlsen didn't do this. They wanted to just develop and so on. But specifically here, the computer points out that if bishop takes c5, this is why black is perhaps struggling a little bit, because this bishop needs to defend g7, and knight h5 semi-forces bishop back to f8. If the king castles, as I mentioned earlier, just this is a sitting target now, and I feel very scared for that king. If you ever played g6, then knight to f6 is a very good outpost. And if you play king f8, then also just bishop to g5, occupying the space. It looks very, very scary as well. Perhaps bishop e7, you could even capture and shove the queen to d4 and start attacking things. And it's very hard to gain traction. Just rook b1 will eternally defend the base of the pawn chain, and then you can, as white, continue with a lot of nasty things against the king. Meanwhile, if all of this is parried by one crafty rook move, as we saw in the game, then meanwhile white gets all the fun over here, then of course that's very risky. So that's one option at this moment here, where perhaps d takes c5 is possible and black's back would be up against the wall. However, rook b1 was played, very sensible move nonetheless, just defending this, meaning that perhaps, as we just saw, any attack against this is meaningless. Bishop d7, just developing, stopping any checks, of course. Bishop d3. It's worth noting, c4 looks tempting, but pawns cannot move backwards, and black needs the tension, the attack on d4. If you play c4, just bishop c2, this is now a target. Also, black successfully locked up the position. If b1, the rook on b1, I should say, is defending the b2 pawn, the only weak point of the white structure, then, and meanwhile it's very hard to find an angle to attack it now, then white can once again have all the fun over here, lift the rook up to h3 and do some obvious nasty things to the king side, castled or otherwise. So c4 is not a good idea. So instead of that, h6, just defending against this. Now knight g5 is at least not possible. And, well, castle's king side. Of course, white could have lifted the rook up. But had they done such a thing, well, their king would still be in the center. They'd have to spend some time doing this. And perhaps rook g3 in this specific variation isn't as venomous. This bishop is still here, of course, defending. And without the castled king, it makes sense for Carlsen just to safety first castle. Again, he only needs to draw. Therefore, the queen c7, and clearly intimating that he will castle queenside is Nepomniachtchi. Rook e1, just getting ready. The white's still better, and black hopped in with the knight to c4. Perhaps a slight missed opportunity by Carlsen here was bishop to c2, because there's actually no decent way to protect that pawn. The best move is knight to b3, and then of course white can win the pawn, and we'll just have a look at this because the queen's briefly forced to a2, and even bishop c2 forces the rook, but there's no way to stop b3 e3, the bishop is just so good. And then the queen will escape, and as we'll see here, bishop e4 perhaps, b3, the knight will move, the queen will go to e2 and defend, and the queen's escaped, and white successfully won a pawn. And it's worth saying, all the way back at this moment, if they try to, after, go back too far, bishop c2, if they try b5, then simply knight to d3, and once again, it's kind of getting locked up. If this is forced to happen, then this is very locked up, and indeed knight takes d4 is a very nice move here, just using the space. Black's knights on light squares are good, but white's knights on dark squares, knight could come into here, the knight's just very, very good, perhaps has a bit more of a target, and it's getting very clogged up and locked up. Meanwhile, these are not going away, all of these lines being opened. So black's attack is being closed down, white is still quite open, and as a result, white stands very, very well here. So returning to the game, that was if bishop c2 was played, where black would have had to bend over backwards to defend it and lock the position up on the queen side. Instead, Carlsen played knight h5, which has the specific points of looking at g7, perhaps tethering the bishop to this square. If g6, knight will jump to f6. So knights in the room are dim, but if they can bounce back and they're pressurizing, they have a specific purpose, perhaps it's okay. So very well purposed move. And after bishop b5, well, perhaps knight to b3 was best, just positioning their pieces, the knight pair, deep in the queen side. White's still a little bit better, with more fluid attack on the king side, but black is not without counterplay. You know, there's a lot of tension still in the center and on the queen side, and, well, Jan's definitely achieved a lot of what he needs to get in a must-win position. However, bishop b5 was played, and now Carlsen very expertly, as you'd expect, saw d take c5, because the bishop can't take, because of course g7 would drop, and, well, the king side would then have collapsed already, because you've lost a pawn, and everything else would go down. So queen takes c5 is the only way to recapture, and then the downside would be knight to d4, and indeed this is exactly what happened. And the problem is, this center is very closed right now, and as long as the center is closed, the black pieces will never be seeing the king side here. And if that can't happen, and the queen side stays relatively shut, then, as mentioned, white will have all the fun being the attacker on the king side. So let's see how that panned out. The bishop retreated back, preserving the bishop pair, and also just getting ready to defend e6, which long term could become weak. Queen to g4, there we have it, pressurizing and attacking the king side. Castle's queen side, frankly at this point a very sensible move. White is actually considered significantly better at this moment by computers, and well, that knight is very powerful, makes a lot of logical sense. And well, after queen f4, pressurizing this, of course the king was defending and it's no longer. Queen back to e7, we can see black's really tying themselves up a little bit, trying to defend. But there's definite chances with g5, f5 and f6 in some positions just to open things up. The problem is, of course, if this pawn moves, this is a bit of a problem. And meanwhile, this rook is looking at the queen, so black's being trapped a little bit in the box right now. Carlsen could and should have played queen g3 to just continue the boxing in. Black can't really achieve too much because of the earlier prophylactic a3 move. The only pawn break would be pawn b4, and of course, especially with the king there, you wouldn't want to do that, and it would just lose. b2 is firmly covered by white, so white's just having all the fun. They could even long-term play even a stabilizing move, lift the rook up in some fashion, although the knight's being a nuisance there. But there's nothing much black can do, and again, Carlsen simply needs to draw. So queen g3 would have been a very good move there. But instead Carlsen, and it is a blitz game of course, so in keeping with the inertia of the position, he played b3. And this is well-purposed, hoping to open the queen side up. Of course, with the king now here, it's a very logical move. Unfortunately, and it's very hard in the time control to do this, it slightly opens the center up, because now this knight is dislodged. And this is more important than opening for the rook up in this position, because after captures, of course, you realistically have to capture back. And suddenly it's transformed from this position just 2 moves prior, where this knight was so powerful, to trading off one of the knight pair, and suddenly it's basically this knight versus this knight, and I think we know this knight on its own, well, it's slightly a nuisance to this bishop, but it's not like the bishop's tethered to going anywhere else now. And as a result, this knight is just sitting on the rim. Meanwhile, this knight is perhaps very good. And most importantly, it's worth saying, if this knight could jump perhaps to d4, such as in this position, white is semi-winning once again, because the knight's just so powerful, looking forwards, blocking any potential attack. However, of course, that is not the case, and will Carlsen continue playing with bishop e3? Of course, he's certainly not worse, but suddenly a lot of his advantage, perhaps black is starting to get a whiff of counterplay. And indeed g5, suddenly it went from there's no hope, black's in a box, pushed back, queen on e7, a bit stuck, the queen side closed. Suddenly, with this transformation from the center happening, the center's a bit more open, and that allows, having castled queenside especially, g5 to manifest in the position. The momentum is shifting. Indeed, if captures, this is a blunder, because after pawn captures back, the rook is attacking the knight, and the queen is under attack. There's no decent way to protect. For example, like this, the rook can just take this, and as we've seen earlier in this video, 2 minor pieces will be much better than 1 rook, especially when it's 2 bishops, like so. And as a result, Carlsen shifted over, instead of capturing, to d4. And there followed captures. So suddenly black has achieved an avenue of attack. This bishop is sort of x-raying through. Of course, the queen is blocking. But queens and rooks tend to be pretty poor blockaders of pawns. Knights are definitely preferable, hence why if this knight were only to get to the d4 square, then white's life would be much, much, much better. Instead, this queen's sort of pinioned behind the pawn. The pawn will be forever threatening to move. Now, Carlsen went to f6 to stop the rook on g8 with the knight. It's an octopus knight after all. The problem is it's sort of hitting at empty squares. It's stopping some things, but it's not actively threatening anything. And indeed, after this bishop g7, it's sort of being evicted. And although it's a dark squared position, suddenly the connect 4 that was is no longer there. So this transformation of both the pawn structure and the piece configurations, with the knight being traded off and pawns evaporating, suddenly favors black a little bit more. Suddenly the center is a bit more open. There's a semi-open file, just like white has, and as a result, well, black has some things to look for, and of course he needs to win. So Jan was very likely very happy to firstly have won a pawn, it's worth saying. He did capture a pawn over here, although it's not the best extra pawn, but also more importantly, pawns make way for bigger pieces, and this file could be utilized, as we'll see. Rook e b1, clearly putting pressure, but with this bishop and with this queen, there's no real problems for black just yet, although it's worth saying with queen a7, definitely that could be a problem in a lot of variations. Both sides' kings are not exactly safe. So with Carlsen building up pressure on the b file, Nepo decided to capture on f6, conceding the bishop pair, but specifically because this knight's pretty good. Of course, capturing would be untenable. It would open the rook and the bishop up, which would not be great. And if the knight's there to stay, then it has targets. It is highlighting this bishop here. If the bishop were to go to f4, then e5 can be played, and this center is very, very strong. This is a fork. There are some tactics that mean that queen a7, of course, black cannot capture here, because in this specific variation, bishop f5, rook d7, and now the problem is captures. Whatever happens now, firstly, the queen needs to go to b8 if check, or else the rook on h8 will drop, and therefore if the bishop takes, then b7 drops, and that's all she wrote. And if the king takes, then the rook also takes on b7, and of course the queen is skewered to the king, with the other rook jumping there once bishop captures. So for that reason, at this moment, the bishop on f4 is safe. The best move would be b6 to avoid such a thing and defend it with the knight. Check can still happen, and white might even win the exchange. This is the best line. If the queen dares to come here, ultimately the knight is simply too strong, and with the queens remaining on, this becomes untenable for white. With the queens off, nothing much changes, and actually the bishop's pretty much forced back. And because the knight is on a very good outpost and the rooks are a little bit dare I say, silly, with the knight coming to d2 in a lot of variations. Meanwhile, b5 can just solidify and fix all the pawn weaknesses, and the rook, well, I mean, it can go to b4, but then it's stuck. So the rooks have to do a bit of a dance out of there. Meanwhile, we can see very evident dynamic play. Black would have been no worse in this position had it occurred on the board. However, back at this moment, Carlsen did not play bishop f4, which would immediately have been met with e5. He played queen a7, and this is where the game started to turn. Well, Nepo very quickly positioned his rook on the g line, and, well, Carlsen getting a little bit low on time, clearly feeling the heat here. Suddenly, from a connect 4 pawn structure, suddenly both pawns in the centre have disappeared, and these are now fluid. Meanwhile, yes, this is open, but there's bodies around the king just defending it, keeping it close, or keeping close by and keeping it safe. Meanwhile, less so for this king. He has 2 pawns, but there's a lot looking at him. The bishops are useful, but not exactly in the way. And indeed, at this point, Carlsen played the move bishop f4, hoping that, well, he'd have some counterplay by distracting this queen. Feel free to pause the video to capture or not to capture. That is the question. Can Black get away with capturing that bishop for free? Have a little think. Feel free to pause the video, of course. And then we'll have a look at the answer. Well, Nepo found the answer. He captured the bishop. This was a blunder by Magnus. And the reason is, rook b7 looks incredibly terrifying. There's 1 and 2 different mate threats. Threatened, of course, if the bishop captures, there's a third one with, indeed, queen takes b7. So this looks very consequential, but of course it's Black to play, and Nepo had correctly seen that rook takes g2, check your checks. Of course, Black cannot play anything but a check, or else checkmate, as mentioned. So rook takes g2, can't be ignored. If the king moves either way, the queen will come to h2 or f2, so it has to be captured, and of course Carlsen played it immediately. As you can see, gaining time with the 2-second increment. And now the follow-up check, the key check. Knight to e3 check. A very important move. The reason is, if the queen captures, d4 discovered check, ignoring the rooks. The rooks on their own actually don't do too much. The king can just escape to e8. And more importantly, of course, whatever white does, the queen will now be captured one way or the other. If the queen blocks, then the bishop will capture. If the bishop blocks, then just capturing this, and of course that is mate, and there's no further checks to that black king that are in any way consequential. So that's if queen takes the knight. Well, what if you ignore it? What if you just come back? Well, of course, there's simply too many pieces suddenly around the white king, and all of a sudden queen will come in to g2 and mate. So you can't ignore the knight, you can't capture it with the queen. What if f takes? Well, once again, this pawn was the one piece kind of giving the king some shelter on f1. Now that this pawn's gone to the e-file, this queen is boxing that king in and bring all your pieces to the party. The final piece comes in, rook g8, and this is all she wrote. The best move is actually bishop g6 to delay matters, but this is the point. The queen will now come to f3 check, and that is mate. Carlsen actually resigned at the point where knight e3 was played because there is simply nothing more to be done. The queen cannot capture, the pawn cannot capture without mate in both scenarios, and if the king moves, also mate will happen. As such, the game was over. It was 2-2 in the main section, and that led to tie breaks in the form of sudden death as opposed to Armageddon, which would be more definitive, achieving a winner one way or the other. 3 sudden death games were played, all 3 were drawn. And after the third game was drawn, essentially Carlsen suggested, why don't we share it, to Nepomniachtchi. That then translated to the arbiters being called, arbiters called FIDE, and within 20 minutes of phone calls, it was agreed they could share the title. Very odd occurrence because, of course, the women's section between Zhu Wenjun and Li Tianjie in the final saw 5 sudden death blitz games, where Zhu Wenjun eventually won the 5th game and became the World Women's Blitz Champion. So they didn't decide to share. But in any case, well, I'll be doing another video on that. Very interesting occurrence for sure, never seen before, and, well, definitely some of the other players felt a little bit short-changed, to say the least. So something we'll be examining in the days to come. In any case, hope you enjoyed that. Stay tuned for more. Have a happy new year. Cheers.